Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down complex sources into clear, focused presentations. Today, we're diving deep into a detailed psychological analysis of Donald Trump.
Okay, so the source we're digging into today comes from author Chris Biervey, and it kicks off with a really bold claim. He says this isn't just another biography. No, it's a user manual designed to show you exactly how the system works.
Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts, the author lays down a crucial ground rule, and it's this. The whole point here is to understand how the system operates. Its inputs, its outputs, its patterns. It is not about justifying or excusing any of its actions. That's a really important distinction.
So to really get a handle on this system, the author says we have to go way back, right to the very beginning. He points to two foundational wounds from childhood that he argues basically built the entire architecture of his personality.
The book zeroes in on this one key event in his early childhood. When he was just a toddler, about 2.5, his mother, Marianne, got seriously ill. She was in the hospital for a long time. And that separation, happening at such a critical age, well, the analysis says it created this deep, lasting sense of insecurity.
Okay, so what does that do to a kid? Well, according to this analysis, it led to what psychologists call a dismissive avoidant attachment style. Let me break that down. In simple terms, it's basically a defense mechanism. The child learns that, hey, relying on others for comfort, that's risky. So they start suppressing their own needs and learn to be super self-sufficient. It makes it really hard to trust or depend on anyone later in life. And that brings us to the second formative wound. Because instead of getting comfort for that insecurity, he was taught this really brutal, transactional view of the world by his father, Fred Trump. You can see it right in that quote. The world is split into killers and losers. There's just no middle ground.
Okay, so here's the crucial point. These two wounds, they didn't just fade away. According to the source, they created a kind of psychological operating system. And this system runs on these really clear, predictable patterns that have apparently been consistent for decades.
The author breaks it down into 3 core behavioral programs that are basically always running in the background, shaping every single decision and interaction. Let's walk through them one by one. First up is what he calls the dominance imperative. This is a constant, deep-seated need to dominate every single situation. The book argues this was a lesson he learned from his father and then had drilled into him at military academy, where being aggressive and being first in everything wasn't just encouraged, it was rewarded.
Second, there's the revenge algorithm. Think about it like code that's always running. Slights are never, ever forgotten. Retribution isn't just a response. It becomes a central motivation. And this is something he later promised his supporters directly, using those exact words, "I am your retribution."
And third, you have the loyalty trap. The analysis lays out this pattern of demanding absolute one-way loyalty. Allies are often pushed to compromise their own principles, and then, once they're no longer useful, they're just discarded. And you can see how this connects right back to that dismissive avoidant attachment style we talked about. If you learn from a young age that you can't really depend on anyone, then of course loyalty becomes a one-way street. People become disposable.
All right, so let's look at how these core programs helped build the public persona we all know. The author argues this persona isn't real. It's a carefully constructed myth, built over decades through his business deals, his books, and of course, television.
And the source claims the myth-making really took off with his 1987 book. He coined this phrase, truthful hyperbole. I mean, think about that. It's a total contradiction in terms, right? But the author argues it was this brilliant, strategic way to justify a whole career of exaggeration and, well, falsehood.
And to give you a sense of the scale, wow, during his 4 years as president, the Washington Post fact-checking team documented over 30,000 false or misleading claims. So that pattern of hyperbole was incredibly consistent. And then television came along and basically cemented this myth in the minds of millions. For 14 seasons of The Apprentice, producers and editors took hours and hours of footage and carefully crafted a new reality. They edited out the indecision and trimmed his ramblings into these sharp, decisive pronouncements. They created the character of an infallible business genius.
Okay, so this brings us to the book's central, and maybe its most challenging conclusion. And that's the idea that this core psychology is fundamentally immutable, that it's incapable of change.
And this idea is actually echoed by his own niece, who is a clinical psychologist. In her book, she argues that his core personality has essentially been frozen since he was a little kid, making him unable to really mature or learn from his experiences.
The book uses a really powerful metaphor for this.
It frames these traits not as bugs in the system that can be patched or fixed, but as the load-bearing walls of his entire personality. You see the point? If you were to somehow remove them, the whole structure would just collapse. So in this view, any real, meaningful change isn't just unlikely, it's structurally impossible.
So, here's the final point the author builds towards. If these patterns are so fixed, so consistent that they let us reliably predict his behavior, what responsibility does that put on us, the people watching?
And this really is the ultimate takeaway from the source. The author concludes that understanding these deep-seated patterns isn't just some academic exercise. It actually creates a responsibility to act on that knowledge. He frames inaction as its own form of complicity.